Okay, this is COMP2106, Advanced Server-Side Scripting, and today we're going to be going over authentication. So we're going to be, as I just said before the recording, we're going to be using week 6's code. And just to make it really easy, I'm going to, instead of like creating a new repository, I'm going to go into GitHub and go to, where's my repositories? Right here, repositories. And I'm going to clone down git clone, and then you put in the folder. And one thing that you can do after you do a git clone is you can actually specify the name of the folder that you want it to clone into. So I'm going to call it week 7, and then I'm going to cd into week 7. And then just for myself, I'm just going to remove the .git folder, so that way we don't actually have a Git repository attached to it. And then I'm going to create a new repository, so COMP2106 winter 2019-week 7. And then we'll do the exact commands that GitHub gives us. So I'm going to do a git init. I'm going to do a git commit that says init. Oh, I have to add everything first. Git commit init. And I'm just going to copy this part just because it's easier. Adding the remote branch, and then we want to push to origin master. When I refresh, this is going to be all the same code that we did from last week, but instead of it being with all the commits that we did from last week, it's now just going to be a brand new project with all our code. Some other ways that you can actually do this is you can like fork a repository that makes a brand new repository based on what's there, but just for simplistic sake, I just created a new repo based on what was there. So similar to when we use Express, we're going to have to npm install, make sure all of our modules are installed, and I'm also going to throw this code into our weekly learning for week 7. So create a web link. GitHub code for week 7. Okay. So if we look at our package JSON, we can see the normal dependencies that we've used for different the different things. We're using mongoose to connect to mongoddb. Also, the other thing, who here had issues registering an account with mlab? Was there anyone that had issues with that?
I don't recall us doing something with mlab.
Okay, so mlab is our mongodb cloud instance that we registered last week and the week before. However, I had a person that contacted me saying that mlab is no longer accepting registrations. So there is, mlab is also associated now with actual MongoDB, and MongoDB offers a service called Mongo Atlas. It's very similar to mlab. It's just a little bit more complicated to interface-wise to create a new like database and collection. But if you can't for some reason create an mlab account, you can also create one on Mongo Atlas. It doesn't really, there's no right or wrong. It's just a cloud-hosted MongoDB. That's it. So with this, we're going to be installing several different modules to make our lives a little bit easier. So the kind of go-to module for having login authentication is Passport, which has several plugins that allow you to use different kinds of schemas to log in. So you can actually set it up, as I mentioned in class, can't remember if it was last week or the week before, but you can do login with like Facebook, login with Twitter, GitHub. There's tons of different services that author what is called an OAuth, which allows you to use their service for use your Facebook email and password, but you can still log into another website with it. So Passport is an Express compatible authentication middleware for Node.js. Its sole purpose is to authenticate requests, which it does through an extensible set of plugins known as strategies. Passport does not mount routes or assume any particular database schema, which maximizes flexibility and allows application-level decisions to be made by the developer. So basically what this is it's just a kind of handy way of being able to handle authentication that then uses additional plugins for your different strategies. So if you look under week 7, there are 4 different modules that we're going to be installing. Passport, Passport Local, Passport Local Mongoose, and Express Session. So because we're dealing with Mongoose, we want to install the Passport Local Mongoose. We're also local typically means that you're using your own email password or username password, and then Passport, the wrapper for it. And Express Session is so that way we can have a session that is consistent when we're using our application. So when you log into, in our application, when you log in, you want to make sure that when you refresh the website that you're still logged in, because that happens when you open up either a new tab or you have to, for some reason, hard refresh the page. You don't want it to just time out. So Express Session, while your server is still running, will have that logged in. There's also some other things that you can do. You can do cookie sessions with Express, but these are just the 4 that we're going to install. So I'm just going to install them here. Passport, Passport Local. Let me bump up. Oh, I'm also going to turn off the light for you guys.
It doesn't matter if the dash saves before or after?
Correct. It does not matter if it's before or after for the dash save. Passport Local Mongoose and Express Session. So I know that I've mentioned this a couple times. You always do have to be careful of which modules that you end up installing into your application, because sometimes they don't exactly have the best documentation. However, Passport is actually a pretty good site at having documentation on how to use it in your application. Their website is just passportjs.org, and when you go to documentation, where is it? Maybe it's under strategies? No, that's not right. I was just looking at it in order to see. It's kind of like a tutorial on their site on how to, oh, there we go. So as I said, the first thing that you want to do here is install Passport. And then this is going to be handling the post of our login form. So in here, there's Passport Authenticate Local, and then afterwards, you have this part, which is the user logging in. So what we're going to do is actually create a login form. So if I'm running it, make sure that you are using npm run dev, because we're going to be making a fair bit of changes to our application. And you want to make sure that when we make a change that it will automatically restart. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up Bootstrap, so that way I can put a login on the right side of the page over here. So Bootstrap, navbar, and you want just the right side. There's that one. Well, I'll just take this just for now. So inside of our layout, we have, let me collapse this a bit. Oh, this is still week 6. Let me make sure that I open up the correct week. Week 7. So inside of our layout, right here, we want to have another UL. I think this should work. So now when I refresh, okay, so that just separating it. It's not all the way to the right, but that's perfectly fine. So I'm going to make it go to the login page, which we have not created yet, but we will. And we get a 404. So what we're going to do is we're going to create, we can just do it in our index. Let's do that because there's not much in here. So we're going to do writer.get /login, and we're going to have the request, response, and next. Show login page. And we want to render the login component. And I'm not going to bother giving it any sort of variables just because we don't need to do that right now. And then I'm going to create a login.pug. Which will extend from layout with a block content, which is going to be a container, a form of method post. And we don't have to put the action for the form because we're just going to be doing it to the same page. And then form group label is going to be, we'll do email address. And an input of type is email. And name is email. And also form control. So copy, paste. We'll change this to being password. Can't even imagine how many times you guys have probably created a login form or some sort of form in HTML by now. I'm sure you guys are probably sick of it. But when I refresh, here is our form. All right. So I'll just show that on the board just for a little bit longer. So the last thing actually that we also need is a button of type submit. And it's just going to be button primary. That way we can submit our form when we want to log in. Okay. So now just make sure when you type in your password you can see that nothing's there. And our email. The other thing, last thing actually that we want to put in is we want to put in a required tag. Just because both a username or the email and the password is going to be required for our form. So if they do not enter in a email correctly, we want just the browser to do it. We're not going to do any sort of validation to check like front-end validation because we're going to be handling it on the back end. So if I just did test@test.com, password of test, and log in, we don't have that set up. So I'm going to go through the documentation that they have here, just because it'll be a good place if you guys end up getting stuck when we're doing this in future, that you guys know that you can just go through the tutorial that is on their site and just do it. As I said, I think when I opened up strategies, I think it said 300, or how many did it say? Let me duplicate that. Strategies. Sorry, there's 502 different strategies that you can use for logging in with Passport. As I said, you have Twitter, OAuth 2, local, which is what we're going to be using, Google Auth, HTTP bearer, Facebook, tons and tons of different ones. And probably some of them actually have overlap, where it will be someone made their own Facebook login with OAuth. But because we're just going to be using email, it is, in some ways, it's actually a little more complicated than other stuff, because in here we're going to have to be like encrypting the passwords as a normal sort of thing. But luckily, this does come with some pretty handy stuff. So you can see here, post, Passport, authenticate local. Let's see, providers, no. Configure. So the one thing that we're going to have to do is we're going to have to create, using the Passport local, we're going to have to create a strategy. And what the strategy is what is used when you end up creating your Passport local to handle all the sort of logging in and stuff like that. So we end up requiring in Passport and Passport local into our strategy. So I'm actually going to create a folder called strategies. And here we can do passport local.js. And in here we're going to require in passport and I believe it was, let's just copy what they have here, local strategy. And then most of this we can actually copy. So the important thing is always to make sure that you understand when you copy something from online of what it does. So in here we have a local strategy, which is what we imported up top, and it comes back with a callback that takes the username, password, and a function that's called done. And what done is for is indicating when you're done. So in here, if there's an error, it ends up returning. This is a callback that is actually passed to it and will return back the error. If there is no user, this actually does go over it on their site, but there's a couple different ways that you can return. So the first variable that it returns is an error object, and that's usually, again, if there's an error. If there's no user, there's not actually an error, and it returns false, but it passes back a message of incorrect username. Then it checks if there's a user, but the password is invalid, and it will return back a message of invalid password, false meaning that there's no user, and null meaning that there's no error. Lastly, if all else fails, it kind of assumes that you have found a username, or found a user with the correct username, correct password, and then returns null, meaning again that there's no error, but it returns back the user that was found. So it's a little bit complicated in the way that, personally, I think that it's set up. It's a little harder to read. I'll just do that. But that's kind of the beauty of having this in a different file, is we're going to write this once and then we'll just end up using it in another file. So this is the part where it goes over the callback that is passed to it, that done function. And it's just kind of explaining that the first one, again, is an error object. The second one is the user. And then the third one, which is optional, well, technically the second one is optional as well if you pass an error. But the third one is a message if you wanted to do some additional information. And then there's some middlewares that you can use. So this kind of goes over a bunch of different stuff. So in here is where it creates the form for login and then the route. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to start working on the post for our login. So handle login, and it's going to be a post. And here I'm going to console log request.body and then res redirect to /login, just for now. So did I do in my form action post? Oh, whoops, method is post, not action. Okay, so refresh, and I'll do test at test.com, password of test, log in, and when I open up my terminal, right here you can see that I got email test at test.com with the password of test. So what we're going to do is try to use this passport authenticate local, but we're going to have to throw that in Express at the in our app. So the reason why we throw it in app.js is so that we can end up using it in our application. And I'm sorry for this, there's like a lot of setup for Passport. It's kind of actually annoying the first time that you do it. So in here we have app.use, which is very similar to, as you guys have seen when we have our router and we end up including right here where we include our routes. It's kind of like the exact same thing. So all of these are middlewares that end up getting run through the application that when when you run this through the application, it will hit these first, which will be like keeping your session consistent across pages and giving you different abilities. So you can see right here, initializing session. So I'm going to require an express session. So express session is another module that is, as I've said, is used for your session management. So let's see. So it creates a session middleware with the given options, as well as there's a couple different ways that you can end up using this as well. This is going to be the one that I'll copy. So rate, probably right here is fine. So I'm including in session that we just required in right here, and I'm going to be using it. So the secret is what is used to encode the cookie that we're using, and I'm actually going to put secure to false because we're not going to be using HTTPS. But you can put any sort of randomized characters, and what it's just used is for authenticating the cookie on the server end to make sure that it's a legitimate cookie and not something that a user has generated on their machine and is sending to the server and pretending like they're logged in. So that is fine. But the other thing that they wanted us to use is passport initialize and passport.session. So we also have to require in passport, So just make sure that if you're using, when you are using session, that you want to do session before you end up using this passport session. Chances are that it will end up having some weird side effects if you don't do it in the correct order. And serialize, deserialize user. Logging in, route, and parameters, OpenID. Okay. So, sorry, where was it? Right here. So, and here's where we're going to use our passport authenticate local. And we're actually going to remove this failure flash inside of here. So we already know that our form is submitting correctly because we were console logging out the result of the form. But this has a couple of options that you can give it. So it has a success redirect, which means that upon successfully logging in, it will redirect to the index page. And then it has a failure redirect of redirecting back to the login form. And in here, we don't actually need the failure flash. I'm just going to remove it. So if I end up doing the login, this still will not work completely yet. So test at test.com, enter in test. And we end up getting unknown authentication strategy local. So because we've created this strategy in passport local, but we haven't actually, we don't have our application understanding that we have created this strategy. So it's the default, no. No. Site is super zoomed in. Disable sessions, custom callback, none of that is required. Strategies. So just because it doesn't say it in here, I'm just going to quickly Google it. So using passport with Express. Sure. This is from 2015, which is pretty old, but might still be fine. So we have our local. Oh, so in here they've just used it. Okay. It's kind of. So they've created a model. Okay, yeah, we can, because we've already installed Mongoose, it might actually be easier to use that. So I'm gonna copy this. So inside of our models folder, we're going to create a account model.js. And here it'll have the username, which is going to be email, and the password. And then we end up exporting mongoose.model. So inside of app.js, we're going to require in our model. And further down, we want to use these that are right here. Actually, we'll just take all of that. Okay. I can
What's the function of those lines that you added?
Sorry?
What do those lines functions do?
What do these do?
Yeah.
So when I had this open actually over here, where I think it was just about right here, there was a deserialize and serialize user. I'll just search it. Deserialize. Okay. So what this is used for is serialization is sometimes when you have something as JSON, you can't always represent certain things when you turn it into a string, such as like keeping objects, like very complex objects, like a date object that has all of its functions. You can't just turn that into JSON. So you end up serializing and deserializing so that way you keep all of your functions. So the reason that it has this is if when you're passing stuff to the front end, it can make it a little bit easier. But with the Mongoose plugin that we just used here, we attached Passport local mongoose to our model, which basically extends off of it and then gives it additional functionality that we can use. So inside of here, that serialize and deserialize user command that or function that is right here that it has now actually just been applied onto our account model. So when we end up having to serialize or deserialize the user, it's right there, and we use Passport with the strategy of our account. Does that kind of make sense? Somewhat. Okay. Can probably try to explain it another way. So we also need in our local strategy right here. I'll just make it var to be consistent. So now, deprecation warning, collection, ensure index is deprecated, use create indexes instead. That's nothing that we can do. So now if I try to log in, so test@test.com, password of test, and we get a 302, which I'm just going to make this redirect to a different page, probably meaning that we did not log in correctly. So test@test.com, password of test, and what it's ended up doing is checking in Mongoose and trying to log in with that user, but that user does not exist. So of course it redirects back to the login page on failure that we have right here. So we'll also have to be setting up registration, but no, we'll probably have to do that first just because of, yeah. So register. just here, adding routes. Okay. So we'll duplicate our login form that we just made. And we'll call it register. And that's fine. I'll just throw up a h1. This is register. And then inside of our route, I'll just use index again, actually. And copy, paste, register the login form. So in here we have our register form that we want it to say, instead of login, we'll say create account. Oh, did that to the login. There we go. Create account. Test at test.com. Test, which will error out because we haven't done the post. So from here, we can take the strategy that we created in our model of the account. So in here, they've required in their account and passport, which we've already included passport, but we need the model. So in here, we end up doing reader.post on /register. And here, similar thing, they do. Okay. So in here, with those additional, with the plugin that we registered an account, another function that it had done was the register, which we end up saying, similar to when we created like a new anything using Mongo, we end up using a new account. So similar thing, we create a new account with the username, which is now just going to be email from request body email, and also the password. Then it has the function, which is the callback, checking if there's an error. And if there is an error, it will redirect back to register. And then in here, it ends up doing passport authenticate local, which means that it will take, it will authenticate based on our express session with the local passport, and then it just redirects back to the home page, which I know is a little bit confusing first glance at this, but it does two things. This is the part where it registers a new account, then it has the callback when it's done. It checks if there's an error, and if there is, it redirects back to the register page to allow them to try to register again. Otherwise, it logs them in. In some applications, sometimes you have it so that a user will have to confirm like an email that gets sent to them. So that way you know that it's not a bot that's registering an account, or at least makes it harder for the bot to register the account. In this case, we just end up logging them in and then redirecting them back to the home page. So if I open up here, so test at test.com, password of test, create account, and apparently there was an error because it put us back to register, so I'll just console log what that is. No username was given. It's using email, password, 222. That's weird. Okay, well, we'll just end up doing, instead of an email, we'll just do a username. So we'll just switch this just from email to user. Save. Okay, so refresh. So user123, password of password, create account. And now if I open up MLab, and go to the database, we're still using week 6, so I'll just continue to use that. But now we have an accounts collection that has a fair amount of information. This is why I didn't just create the user for login, because it ends up creating a salt and hash for that user. But we have the username 123. So perhaps passport local. Passport local. It might actually be with the username only. That might actually be why. Passport local email password.
You know how to change it.
So the local authentication strategy authenticates users using a username and password. So you could probably actually set it up that username is the email that is submitted. It's looking for an actual variable called username, which is where it gets a little bit confusing because in some applications you do use the email as the username. So what it's looking for is this username, but if we switch it just back to being an email, sorry for people that switched it back to being email address, and same thing with this, email address. If we were to register a new user, going to /register, so we could do test@test.com, password of test, create the account, bad request. Interesting. Wonder why that is. This test@test.com. So a user with the given username is already registered. Okay. I think there just might have actually been some sort of error that had happened outside of what we did, but the user with the username test@test.com is registered. So now we should be able to actually log in with test@test.com with a password of test, and that they did not log in. So on failure, we get redirected to the login page, which is what we want to do. Unless if it tried to create it with the other test@test.com, maybe password. Nope. Let me just register one more account. Test@test.test, password test, create. Why does it? Okay. And then go to login, test@test.test, password test, and it still does not log in. So I'm going to guess because we're getting a bad request that when we try to do passport authenticate local, that it is not working. Maybe that's fine. Hold on, let's just delete everything that's in the collection. So now we have no users once more. Inside of our index, we're passing the email to the username and we're giving it request body password. And lastly, in app.js, we initialize. This is all good. That's all fine. So in theory, that should work. So let's just try it one more time with registering. Test@test.com, password of test, create. Still bad request. I wish it said why. So I'm just going to quickly go through this and see if I missed anything that's obvious. So in here we have username and password, that's all fine. App use, that's all good. Mongo connect, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So it does create the account, which is what we want it to do, but then it does not log in. It just redirects them to login fail. Login, test.test.com, test, there goes login fail. So there is something that is failing. So the other thing that it had done is you can do request response like in our other stuff, and console.log request.user. Okay, so we'll do a quick 10-minute break. I'm just going to try to figure out what small thing is missing, but you guys are more than welcome to go get food. It's always good when you try to demo and it doesn't work, because like I said, this is usually something that you set up once in an application and then you're good until you sometimes build the next one, in which case you typically copy paste from the last one. I feel like it's just something really small with how we have set up our local passport, just because when we try to authenticate with what we have created, it errors out. And that is both in registering as well as doing this login. So I'm going to try to see if I can figure out what's going on. Other than that, be here back in, say, about 10-15 minutes. And if anyone has any questions or So for those who are watching the video later on, the reason why this stopped working, or actually was never working, is because we were using email as the name in the form, and it needs to be username. And the reason for that is passport local is expecting request body username and request body password. So even though that our input is going to be of type email, what it needs to be called when it's sent to the server is username. So we're, as Brando was saying, we can expect it to be of an email type, but that the name of what we're calling it is going to be username. And really, I should have, well, I did know it, just not at the time. So right here it says passport strategy authenticating with a username and password. So when you do everything, it's going to be username, password, username, password. So like everything is done with that, and if you try to like strive out of it, it's kind of hard. But they do have, they don't have examples of how to do it, which is fine. But anyway, so that was why it wasn't working. So I know some of you, what you tried to get working in your projects was if you are on a specific route, it will change what the active class in your nav bar is. Was it did anyone here try to do that?
Yeah.
Yeah, a couple of you tried to do it. And we're going to be doing something that's kind of similar, but in this case, what we're going to be doing is displaying if it needs to be login or if it needs to be log out, based on if the user is logged in or not. So where is it? So in our login route, I've put back in on a success redirect. It will log in or redirect to the root of our project, and on failure, it will be on the login again. So just to show you, if I log in with a username of test@test.com and a password of test, instead of being greeted with our login page, it's logged in and it's now on the root. However, we still have this in our nav bar saying log in. So now here's the thing. As soon as I save and make a change to our server, actually we're using cookies, so actually I might be fine. Usually when you make a change though, it will, if you're using like an in-memory solution, the moment that you restart your server, it will lose any sort of sessions that are logged in. So I'm just going to make a middleware, or actually I'll just use request response and next, and console.log request.user and next. So if I refresh, that doesn't exist. But if I use test@test.com, test, now here we get the user. So if I go to another page, let me put these side by side so it's a little bit easier to see. Do I not have it open? No. There we go. Okay, so when I switch the page, if I go to home, it logs out the user. And of course, if I switch to another page, classes, logs out the user. And what's good about this is if I were to, in this case, when I do save, it will destroy the user session, because now when I refresh, I now get undefined. So it automatically attaches it to request.user, so that way you can reference who is logged in. So we can actually do this of checking if the user is logged in or not. So when we're dealing with like a global variable that is passed to every view. I believe it's res.locals that you want to use. So in this case, if I use res.locals.loggedin equals request.user. And what I'm going to do is there's a small thing. You can do 2 exclamation marks. And what this does is, because undefined, if you are doing a Boolean, is false. But if there's an object, it's true. So what this does is it turns it actually into a Boolean of false, and then it turns it back into true. It's another, you can do this and it will equate it to what the Boolean value of that is. Because I don't know if you guys have ever seen that picture. There's like a grid that will show you like what values equal what values in a truthy kind of thing. I don't know if you guys have seen that or not. Truthy value chart Java script. This is usually pretty good to know. So in here, if something is null, negated, so there's a couple different things. So 1 as a string is true, 0 as a string is false. 1 as a string can be turned into 1 and 0. True as a string is not actually compared to the Boolean of true, because what this does, this is why I write a lot of code using triple equals instead of double equals. So when you're trying to convert something into a Boolean, when it's a string, if it has no values in it, it means false. So you can check in a Boolean way of checking if a character, or if a string has more than one character, or yeah, 1 or more characters, or basically just checking that it's not empty. So in this case, when you try to check if a string and turn it into a Boolean, it will actually be, it will be true because it has more than one character, unless if it's empty. But when it comes to string numbers, it's a little bit different. So there's, anyway, this is a chart that just kind of shows you what different values can equal different values when you're turning it into different types, which is a little bit almost like out of scope. But the reason why is because I can check if this is undefined. When it goes into the Boolean constructor, it will be false, unless if there's an object that is there with the values in it, in which case it will be true. So I can tell by converting it to a Boolean if the user is logged in or not. So if now I just log locals.loggedin, when I refresh this, so they're logged in as false. Ooh, what just happened there? That's fine. So false, if I go to /login, I'm still not logged in. Type test@test.com, password test. False as I do a post, but then it's taking its time, it's still loading. Test@test.com. Perhaps it's getting actually hung up on here. There. I don't know why that was preventing it, but anyway. That's why usually I just use to. Let's try that one more time. /login, test@test.com, test. There. So now it's true. So now when I refresh and I go to different pages, it says I'm logged in. So I'm just going to remove console logging those. But now across every single page, I should be able to use this locals.loggedin.
Can you put a comment on the function of that?
Yep. Middleware for creating global variable of is logged in based on truthy / falsy value of request.user from passport. Is that good?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. So now inside of my layout, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do is log. Well, is it is logged in or just logged in? Okay. So I should be able to, by looking at this. Now because I've used res.locals, that variable is passed to every single view, which means that I don't have to worry about in every like res.render, I don't have to pass in this is logged in variable every single time, which makes it a little bit easier. So in this case, I'm logged in false. I'll just make this bigger so that way it pops it right beside. So I do login, test at test.com, test, and now I am logged in. So now based on this value, I can now decide if I want to display the login or the log out nav item. So I could just do if logged in I want to display log out, and I want to do /logout else, and save that. So in here we just throw a comment, if logged in display log out, and refresh. So now it says log out, and that goes to /logout. But if I were to update the application, save here, refresh, now it says login, and now I can log in. So you can do this with, if you're wanting to do a lot of like customization in stuff that will be globally wide, that's where you start using those like res.local variables, as well as there are some other ways that you can do application specific stuff, but that's also kind of outside of what we're doing here. But the easiest thing is just now I can do test at test.com, log in, and now it shows log out. So let's do the log out part, which is probably the easiest part now that we have registration working and logging in working. So it uses, there might be two parts just because of, doesn't say it in there. Oh, okay, they actually make it even easier. So it ends up using request.logout, and there's another thing that you can also do, which will probably handle this. You want to do what is called destroying the session. And what that does is it makes sure that there's nothing kind of lingering around on the server. Because typically in large-scale applications, you don't handle the session on just the server. So in the case of large companies, let's say Facebook, actually I'll do one that happened a while ago, was GitHub. So GitHub, I want to say 4 or 5 months ago, had a issue where sometimes when you went from page to page, your session wasn't consistent. So sometimes you would go from like a repository to like an issue, and all of a sudden you weren't logged in. And then you would refresh the page, and then you were logged in. And you'd refresh it again, you're still logged in. You'd refresh it, and then you're logged out again. And what happens is you have all of these servers that you have the same website hosted on multiple servers, especially around the world, that usually connect to a store, and they keep the sessions in the store. So that way, if you were to have a server that goes down, you don't have to like repopulate all the sessions. It just connects to it to know who's logged in, who's not. So that was kind of like a little bit of a tangent, but that is why we end up destroying a session, so that way when you destroy it, wherever you're holding your sessions, you make sure that they're all gone. It's not just on that server. So in here, we're going to have our logout route, which in here is just going to do /logout, and I'm going to make them go to the login page. And there's an error. Oh, whoops. This needs to be router.get, not app.get. And we're all golden. And refresh. Okay. So now I can log in. And I do test@test.com. I type in test, and I'm logged in. I can now go about our classes from last week. And then when I'm done, I can click log out. And now I'm not logged in anymore. So that's how you use Passport, along with a couple plugins that we were using, Passport Local and Mongoose, for being able to pretty easily, without having to do anything, it created the stuff for us. So we don't have to generate a salt for encryption for our passwords, because of course we don't want to keep it in plain text. We also didn't have to worry about doing any sort of compares of checking, you know, if the username is in the database and if the password matches the encrypted one, blah, 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 blah. We don't have to do any of that sort of stuff. What's nice is this has kind of abstracted it for us and made it easier. I say easier in brackets because obviously just before the break I did have a couple of issues of just trying to get that to work. But if you were like, say a bigger company and some of these things don't necessarily work for you, you can also just create your own strategies and use it still with Passport to use your own kind of custom encryption and so on and so forth. So yeah, in summary, like Passport is kind of the big go-to for doing any sort of logged in stuff. Any sort of authentication. I'm sure there's probably a couple of you who would have liked to use this on the assignment because it is kind of fun to have someone logged in. But don't worry, it will be a part of assignment 2. So you all get to use that. Also, I'll mention after reading week, I'll kind of go into assignment 2 for you guys. But assignment 2 is a group project. So if you want to start to like figure out who you want to work with, I can't remember, max of 3 people per group. And then for anyone that is watching this video, because you guys are online people in the class, please feel free to just shoot me an email so that way I have a list of online students who I can try to get connected. So that way you guys can do this. All right.
Are you possibly able to release the assignment on Blackboard for the rubric, like the requirements to be visible?
I'll probably have to tweak them again.
That's fine. Yeah. But like just before we get back, like.
Yeah, I can do it over probably reading week. Yeah. I'll have some time in order to do that and not have to like prepare a week of classes. Okay. So, stop. But yeah, so is there any questions thus far with what we've been doing with authentication? No? Is it because you don't have any questions because it's over your head and you're like, I don't even know what to ask? Partially? Partially. Okay.
Gotta be a mixed bag.
Yeah.
Are we going to be handling views based on if the user's logged in today?
Yeah. I was actually just about to do that. So Passport has the ability, well, as we saw, we can use res.locals to see if they're logged in or not. We've kind of already done that. But you can also use, so we haven't used it much, but middlewares. So what middlewares are is picture it basically like a route that is used for multiple things that you can throw in front of stuff that you want to be like a protected route. So in the case of a login route, it doesn't necessarily make sense for a user to be able to hit it if they're not logged in. Obviously, it's not a hugely important thing. Usually you would, let's say something that would be better for a logged in route would be, say you have an admin dashboard that is able to manage content across the entire site. You don't want that to be accessible to people that are not logged in. You also don't want it to be accessible to people that are not administrators. So in here, not authorized. Protected. Just trying to see if they have a quick snippet. Protected route passport.js. Okay. So, oh, I could have actually just used that. So there is a thing that's called request.isAuthenticated, which is a function that you will run. So instead of having to convert this part, I can just do request.isAuthenticated, and it will then check if they're logged in or not. So if I just refresh that, it still has here, and then now it's authenticated, which is nice because it will now go through Passport. But if we can use that, they kind of have an example right here where this is a middleware that takes in the exact same stuff that we use, so request, response, and next. And here it checks if they're authenticated. And if it is, it uses this return next. And I've mentioned before that next will go to the next route that is available, which might be a little bit confusing at first, but I'll just throw it right here. Actually, no, let's not throw it here. Let's protect something that makes more sense. Classes. So inside of our classes route, we don't want a user able to see classes if they're not logged in, kind of like Blackboard. So what we can do is take this code, that is, it checks if the user is authenticated, and if it is, it goes to the next route. Otherwise, it will redirect back to login. So what's nice is you can now just do this right in front of it. So in this case, you can actually give an unlimited amount, well, in quotes, unlimited amount of like middlewares that you want to use before. So in here, what I could do, just to show you that it doesn't have to just be as a function, so I can create a console log here and use next, and then just put in request response next. That made that look really ugly. That's fine. But basically what it ends up doing is it hits this middleware. And what that does is it checks if we're authenticated, and if it's not, it'll go to the next one, which in this case will be this one right here. So in here we end up just console logging blah, and then we call next again, which in this case will then run this code. But if you don't use next, it will never get to the next block of code or next middleware or whatever, which is why we end up usually doing like res.render or res.send. So instead of redirecting, I'm just going, oh no, we'll keep it as redirecting, that makes sense. So in here, if I refresh, I try to go to classes, it doesn't work. But the moment that I log in, I can click it, and then you'll see also right here blah, because it's hit that block of code, and now we have our classes. It's actually
you can go to create class at this point, and because it's a different route within that,
yes.
If you were logged out, you can still access it.
Correct.
Okay.
But here's where it gets a little bit fun. So instead of throwing this on just that one route, what we can do is take it out of here, and we can make it so that everything that is inside of classes is protected. So we can, instead of doing retter.get, retter.use, and we do our ensure authenticated, which means now I can't access anything that is inside of classes, this is the point of splitting up your routes into separate files, because then you could make it so that, I don't know, maybe everything, let's do a quick example. Let's say in the case of my admin dashboard, I have a file that's called admin dashboard.js. And in here, I could include all the routes that are for an admin dashboard, but then I only have to put in, so let's partially do this. You don't have to follow along. This is just more as an explanation. But retter.use post retter. So you have stuff where you want to manage posts, threads, maybe something with blog, whatever, you kind of get the idea. So you would have all these different things that would be for an admin dashboard. And what you could then just do is just make sure that all of them is using this ensure authenticated. And it means that before it ends up ever getting to anything related to the admin dashboard for posts, threads, blogs, etc., it has to meet the criteria of being authenticated. So then you could, in theory, just do this across an entire application. If the entire application has to be logged in, you could just, at the very beginning, just have a ensure authenticated.
You could put it in the app.js and use it for all your routes?
Exactly. There is one asterisk that I want to put in. You don't want to do it because, as I've mentioned, that Express and kind of Node.js kind of works as a first come, first serve. So depending on the ordering of your stuff, you want to make sure that your ensure authenticated comes after your login page, because you don't want to make it so that your login page requires you to be logged in, because you will get an endless loop. So this is how you would kind of like protect like an entire area of your site. If you threw it in app.js, right now with the way that we've set it up where it's looping over our config, it wouldn't work right now because we're just looping from a file. But if you wanted to, you could have like a, I'll edit this one. You could have public routes where you loop over everything that is publicly accessible. And then immediately after that, you could then use app.use require login. And then you could have a protected routes file that you loop over everything that is then protected. So yeah, it's actually surprisingly easy to protect a route or a group of routes. So, and just to show you this, right now, anything that is in classes, if I try to access it, doesn't work. But if I were to just even move this down below, I can now access it. But I cannot access create. It still is going to login. This is where it comes to the first come, first serve. So it comes into this file. We are able to load the index of classes because it happens above this ensure authenticated. But now everything that's below here doesn't work. But maybe we'll make it so that that way a user can see the create form. We don't want them to be able to create, but now they can see it. And if they try to create, it requires them to log in. And then, of course, when you use this, you can also expire sessions. So that way, if I'm sure you guys have seen on sites, you come back after 15 minutes. A good example would be like a bank automatically logs you out after a certain amount of time of it being idle. And that also happens. You can also do that here. So if you try to do an action, it's still protected, right? So you're not actually considered authenticated. So then it will just redirect you to the login page. So anyway, hope that answered your question. It's almost like, I don't know, it's just like a good feeling at how easy it is to protect requiring authentication. Now, what does get a little bit more complex is if you wanted to do like a user role authentication of saying like a regular user versus a moderator versus an administrator on a site. That comes into a little more complexity, but you could just set that up inside of your model that you created and end up creating extra functions of saying like if is moderator or if is administrator in the same way that we have is authenticated. So.
And then are we also doing, are you supposed to have to destroy a section?
Yeah, it actually kind of already, because we're using Passport, it handled it for us.
That was just to end the session, right?
Great. Hold on. In index, go away. I swear it's so easy to accidentally click on stuff. So right here, request.logout, that automatically handles our session for us. But
Can you say there's a difference between logging out and destroying the session?
I was saying, so sometimes because we're using request.user, you can't just set like request.user to undefined.
Okay.
Request.logout is automatically handling that destroying of session for us, but sometimes you will use a session without using Passport. And that's where you have to destroy the session. So yeah, let me open up Express session. And search destroy. So here we have the session. So inside of our middleware that we put here, I'm just going to console log request session. So refresh. We still have a session, which is actually kind of interesting. Or not interesting. Like so as soon as you start on a site, that's using like say like a cookie, you have a session. You can destroy that session, but as soon as you go to the site, it just generates then a new one, right? So if I were to go to the login page, so I still have my session here, test.test.com, and you'll see that the session now changes. So now it's using Passport as a part of our session with the user being the email that we entered in. So, but instead of using request.logout, which is a kind of easy method, we could do request.session.destroy, which then has a callback when it's done, right? Has an error object, if error, console log error, and then we could just move this up here. And I'll comment out request.logout. So again, refresh, there's nothing here. Go to login, test.test.com, test. So two things, it says log out because we're using request.isAuthenticated, but once I click log out, it destroyed our session and it still handled the Passport part of isAuthenticated. So it's almost a way of thinking that request.logout through Passport is like request.logout doesn't exist by default, but through using Passport, it has created a helper function in order to use it. and it's almost alias to using request session destroy. So yeah, so to answer it, destroying a session is for express session that we're using, is not a part of Passport, but Passport has its own function to destroy the session that it's using. So I'm sure that there's probably actually other session managers that can be used inside of like Node and Express. Like Express session is just one of the more common ones. As you can see here, its weekly downloads is at 601,000. So there's a lot of people that are using it. But yeah, let me try to remember if there was anything else that I was going to go over. We went through that even quicker than I thought we were going to. gc.blackboard. Weekly learning. So we've done that. How do I structure related data in MongoDB? Additional resources. I have a good feeling that it doesn't have as much because it's only the 26. It's probably after reading week, so we've used that. Use the local strategy, we've done that. Configuring. Oh, so you see here where it's using passport use local and all this stuff where it's like checking if there's a user, new password, generate hash. All of this is handled now. So it makes it a lot easier. These are kind of like older things where you had to do a lot of this manually. You don't have to do that anymore. User model.
Is this like PDF accessible to us?
Yeah, it's on in week 7. So in here, creating the authentication views, which we've done, login, authentication routing, displaying flash error messages. I suppose that's the only other thing that we could also do. So previous versions of Express used to come with something that's called Flash, which is being able to send messages between routes really easily. And the reason why that is useful is when you're handling a login and you want when you're handling a login and they log in unsuccessfully, when you redirect, there's not a way to pass variables when you do a res redirect. But when you are using connect flash, what it does is it does it kind of throws it in your session, and it has a one-time use. So when you request a message from connect flash, as soon as you request it, it deletes it and you can't access it anymore. And the reason why that is useful is displaying error messages to the user of letting them know. So yeah, I guess that'll be the last thing that I'll end up doing is just using Connect Flash really quick, just to show you how that works on both the register page and the login page. Probably login's easier. So npm install /save connect flash. And in order to use Connect Flash, we have to include it into our app. So in here, it's talking about how to use it in 3, So we have that. We want to use Flash. So inside of app.js, we have Flash. And down here towards our stuff, we want to use app.useFlash. And now we have this handy request.flash. And what that does is the first part, like this one here, is where it ends up setting a message of info with the value of flash is back. And then down here, when you don't specify a second variable, is where it returns back the value of what is inside info in this example. So in here, because Passport has a failure flash, we can say there was an error. And then inside of login, so we redirect to /login, and we can say error is request flash. I'm just wondering what it might be called, because it automatically handles it for us. So failure Passport failure flash. So it has a failure. Is it just error? Okay. That seems kind of weird, but I'll just I'll console log it here, kind of how they were doing it, and throw this to the side. Let me close some of these. So this is the login page, so test@test.com, and our password is going to be something else. Click login. Okay, so here's the flash. We can see here that flash was added to our session, and there was an error. And if you were to console log request.flash error again, it shouldn't exist because it's a one-time thing, unless if it only exists in the duration of the... Oh, I logged in successfully. Whoops. Don't you hate it when you accidentally log in by accident? Okay, so there we go. So the first time was us requesting that error flash, and then immediately after we got it, we tried to request it again, but it didn't exist. So they're kind of one-time messages, which is really useful because you can pass stuff between different pages, and as soon as you access it, it doesn't exist anymore. So yeah, I guess this is like a really short class. Is there anything that people would like to know and we can maybe continue to go on? Other than that, that's really the basics of how to use Passport with authentication. Is there anything that people didn't understand? I could see request flash. I kind of went over that really quickly, but like I said, they're just kind of like one-time messages. So
would you use that to handle outputting like a registration and login form for errors? Is that basically what it would be for?
Exactly, yeah. So
and can you control with, I guess, would you use just like a condition to say which input field it goes over, or?
Yeah, so if we had done a more kind of custom model for when there's an error, instead of just having it go into an object called error, we could have a couple different ones. We could have Passport error, and we could have email error, of being able to determine if the error is because the email address doesn't exist, or if it's because the password is wrong. In some cases, you'll see like a lot of sites nowadays just recommend to have a generic error message saying the username or password that you have entered is incorrect. And the reason for that is if you look at a site like Facebook that has probably in the billions of accounts on Facebook. So you have a chance of having a username that might be 1 or 2 characters off from someone else's username. So if someone mistypes their username and enters in a password, well, that password is always going to be wrong for what they're trying to sign into because of their email address is incorrectly typed. But that might still be a valid email address, and you don't want to give the user a false sense of understanding that the password that they're typing is the one that's incorrect, which is why a lot of sites will say both of them are incorrect. The combination that you've entered is incorrect, because another thing that you can do is when people try to guess passwords, what they'll do is they'll try to sign in with a email address to see if that user is even registered on the site. I'm sure you guys are familiar with all the different like password dumps that seem to be going on an almost monthly basis. That's kind of why is, you know, people's credentials end up getting leaked, and then people will use a login form to see if that user even has an account on the site. So it's some people will tell you it's bad, a bad user experience to have generic messages, which is true, because you should always try to tell the user as much information as possible on what's going on, but sometimes security does have an issue with that. So
it depends on the scale.
exactly, it depends on like what it's for. I mean, displaying, you know, a password requires X fields. Like, of course, you want to be as explicit with that as possible. There's nothing worse than registering on a site where you try to register, and then after you click submit, it comes back to saying, "Oh no, we require, you know, one specialty character, an uppercase, a lowercase, and whatnot."
Some more specific error messages for registration and maybe less for login.
Yeah, which is actually kind of funny, because people do point that out. Is if you go to log in and you say that that's the wrong password for this username, you go, okay, there's a user with that username on this site. That's easy to know. But when you go to a register form and you try to type in a username, it'll say that that username's already registered. So it's literally the exact same thing. So it's really up to the discretion, but I just thought that I would bring that up because from a usability standpoint, if they've entered their username wrong, you don't want to say, oh, it's the password, right? So
Makes sense.
yeah, long tangent. So now what I'm doing is just taking an error, if there is one, and inside of our login page, I'm just going to throw error right there.
You don't even have to say it's true because it's not set otherwise.
Yeah. So nothing pops up. So that's it. You can also just you could do like a if error, so that way it doesn't even render it to the page. Because usually what's a good idea is, as you guys know with like design, when new content comes in, usually you want to have a placeholder of that area where the content would go in. So you don't want, in this case, if I enter in a wrong username and password, the content is now going to get pushed down the screen because that paragraph tag didn't exist before. So when I do that, it pushes it down, which is kind of like a small amount. But if you end up doing this per field, kind of as you were saying, you know, email and password, sometimes if you have a longer form, it might shift it quite dramatically. So anyway, yeah, so that's how you end up getting the error message from there. I'm sure that there's a way that you can configure what error message is coming back and which flash that it goes into and stuff. But you can also just use request flash by yourself. without having to even go through with Passport. So anyway, any questions? Nope. Okay. The video for this class should probably be up, I'm going to guess, tomorrow. And yeah, there's not any sort of assignments. Other than that, I hope you guys enjoy your reading week, and I'm sure you guys will get lots of reading done over your reading week. Yeah. And as per usual, if you guys have any questions, like, I mean, there's no homework assigned for the next class after reading week, but if you guys end up doing any sort of stuff and continue your learning because you're actually interested in this, just message me on Slack. I'm available probably because I'll be working. So anyway, that's that.